maintenance workers, cable guys, or people who enter homes for a living? What's the most unsettling or downright horrifying thing you've encountered in someone's house? Story 1. Back when I was doing HVAC work, I was sent out on a call to do a minor repair, fix an air line that had somehow gotten disconnected somewhere between the air handler and the vent. Pretty typical call. Usually very easy once you find the problem. No biggie. I got to the house, knocked on the door, and the lady let me in. I asked her to take me to the room where the air wasn't blowing, and she hesitated. Do you really need to go in there? Can't you just go up in the attic and find where the line might be bad? I told her that I probably could. She said, I would appreciate it because the baby is asleep in that room, and I don't want you waking him up from his nap. I agreed. She showed me where the attic access was, and I climbed up after giving her my word that I would do everything I could to be as quiet as possible and not wake the baby. I went up into the attic, found the torn line, measured out how much flex line I would need to replace it, and headed out to my truck to grab the materials. As I was heading back into the house, I heard a noise that sounded like a cross between a rabid moose in labor and that screaming goat from YouTube. I saw the woman running down the hall saying, "It's okay, baby, mommy is coming." At this point, I was wondering what on earth could be wrong with her baby to make such a horrendous sound. I just went back up into the attic to fix the line so I could get out and move on to my next job. Once the line was fixed, I couldn't resist a peek while hooking up the flex line to the vent. My jaw dropped. Her baby was a full-grown adult, probably in his 30s, about the same age as her. She was changing his diaper and talking to him in baby talk, while he lay there sucking his thumb and shaking a rattle. When I finished hooking everything up, I went back down into the house, called out that I was done, and told her I'd be right back with some paperwork for her to sign. She signed it. I thanked her, wished her a nice day, and left forever, haunted by the image of her changing the diaper of a full-grown man. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. Not my story, but one a guy working for the power company recently told me, and it was way too crazy not to share. He described his first day on the job, which also happened to be his worst. He went on a call to an elderly man's house because they were going to upgrade his meter and move it to the exterior of the home. It had been in the basement since the house was built. The power company had tried to contact the man by phone and mail, with no success, so they sent techs in person to see if they could speak to him and get the meter moved. When he arrived at the house with his boss, they immediately noticed an insane number of flies around the front door and porch and a god-awful smell. Anyone who has smelled a decomposing body knows it is unforgettable. Convinced something was terribly wrong, they called the police. A police officer arrived and immediately agreed there was likely a dead body inside. The officer opened the front door, which had been unlocked the entire time, and yelled for a response. Nothing. They followed the officer inside. The house was in rough shape, which is not uncommon for an elderly person living alone. But as they searched for the resident, they came across a horrifying scene in the basement. The elderly man's body, along with the bodies of his 2 large dogs. The man had apparently passed away in his chair in the basement, where he had sat for some time. His dogs, left without anyone to feed them, had eaten away at his arms and legs up to the knees and elbows. In the process, they had dragged his body across the floor, leaving a trail of decomposition and bodily fluids. The dogs had survived for a while by eating the man and drinking water that was trickling near a humidifier. However, the water company had shut off service due to non-payment, and the dogs eventually died of dehydration. Their bodies were already beginning to rot when discovered. All of this happened on the first day of the guy's job with the power company. He was lucky enough to see some photos on his phone, and according to him, it was just as bad as it sounded. Somehow, this didn't deter him. He said that at the point he was telling the story, he had been with the power company for 5 years. Story 3. Recently, I had the pleasure of coming across an S-worker just as she was finishing up with a client in a vacant half of a duplex. She lived on the other side and was working out of the empty side. She had a mattress set up in the living room, and I knocked on the door just as her client was opening it to leave. I think he freaked out when he saw me. Oh, I can't believe I forgot about the exotic dancer shack. It was my first week in my own area, pretty much out of training and on my own. To get me eased into things, my then supervisor had me checking on properties that we had vacated to make sure no one had moved back in. He assured me they would probably still be empty, but we had to verify them every 30 days. I had checked about 4 that day, and when I rolled up to the last one, I saw a child's bike in the yard and a light on in the kitchen. I didn't feel comfortable going up to that one and knocking alone, so I went back to the office and told my supervisor. We went out the next day and verified that someone was definitely in the house, but they weren't coming out when we knocked. Then we noticed a security camera over the door of the small shed in the back. I asked if anyone had bothered to knock there, and no one had. So another inspector knocked, and a man opened the door, sleepy-eyed and groggy. My supervisor recognized him as someone he had evicted from the property before. He was a squatter, not the owner. My supervisor asked who was in the house, and the man said his son, his wife, and their children. We gave him a chance to go in and get them out before the police officer arrived so they wouldn't be arrested. He went in, but they were gone. Somehow, they had managed to slip out of the house without us seeing them. This house sat on a corner lot, so that was no easy feat. My supervisor gave the man in the shed the same deal: get your stuff and leave within the hour. Even after the cop showed up, we wouldn't have cited him. As he was gathering his things, we took a peek inside the shed to see what he had set up. My supervisor got a better look than I did and said he had a full bar set up with food, liquor, and everything. There was even a window AC unit. A couple of hours later, I was at a CVS nearby, and a man came up and said he was the pastor of a nearby church and had seen me at that house. I mentioned the setup in the shed, and that's when he told me it wasn't just a bar, it was a dance club. This shed was maybe about 150 square feet. I am not kidding. The exotic dancer shack is about 4 houses down from the aforementioned working girls' residence, by the way. Story 4. I was doing home inspections for a FEMA contractor in Texas and had scheduled an appointment through a third party because the homeowner wouldn't answer calls from unknown numbers. The friend I spoke with assured me that the property wasn't an abandoned warehouse and that the man lived in the portion that used to be a dojo. A time was set. I arrived at the crumbling building and knocked on the open door. The place was packed to the ceiling with boxes full of stuff. The entire area had flooded about 5 inches, leaving everything soggy and moldy. This was weeks after the event, and no effort had been made to move or salvage anything. I could hear movement in the far back, but nobody responded when I called out. I backed away to wait near my car and called the friend, who then contacted the homeowner. He assured me his friend was inside and waiting for me to enter. I entered just as a 50 to 60-something-year-old man came out of a back room in a tiny towel. He was soaking wet and smirking at me, one lazy eye wandering. He wanted to start the interview portion of the inspection like that. I asked him to get dressed. He left the door halfway open while doing so, making sure to flash himself at the doorway. I proceeded with the inspection and interview, and he tried to touch me at every chance he got. If I handed him a stylus for signing, his soft, baby-fat fingers would brush against mine. I looked like a stereotypical angry flannel-wearing lesbian, but he was not deterred. I hurried through the walkthrough and learned that he didn't own the place, just rented. He only occupied a room the size of a walk-in closet, and none of his things had been affected. He said he wanted his government check and someone to talk to because he gets lonely. As I left, he offered me lots of alcohol that he had pre-poured before I arrived, ready to go, just to be neighborly. He even offered me his favorite glass. I booked it out of there as fast as I could. I've done inspections in the absolute worst parts of Miami, and this was still the creepiest, most terrifying experience I've ever had in someone's home. All his behavior could have been written off as accidental, but it was deliberate, pervy behavior. If I had taken that roofied drink, I'm fairly certain I would still be chained up in one of the back rooms. Story 5. I was a cable tech in an older lady's house and had to keep moving the little kids' toys out of the way, rocking horses, little push cars, small dolls, etc. to get to the wall plates and check some connections. This was in 3 or 4 different rooms. I didn't think much of it. I see plenty of kids' toys every day and just assumed she had some grandkids. She kept asking me to be careful when moving the toys, which I was, of course, because I wasn't there to break anything. Still, she was visibly upset and hovered nervously while I worked, so I stayed a little more alert and didn't turn my back on her completely. I noticed there were no pictures of her or her husband anywhere. No photos of kids or grandkids, no pets. Everything was immaculate and spotless, and there was no sign that children had ever been there. That struck me as odd because of all the kids' toys scattered around. I moved a pushcart back to its original spot, and she asked me again to be extra careful, saying these were her babies. What? That's when I finally noticed all the rocking chairs, pushcarts, cribs, and toy chests, each with an actual baby doll sitting on top or lying inside. There were fake bottles everywhere, the kind with pretend milk that moved, random pacifiers, and stacks of tiny fake diapers meant for dolls, just all kinds of strange stuff. I counted 6 or so baby dolls in the rooms I had been in so far, not including the living room. It was definitely creepy. I've never liked dolls or kids' toys after seeing too many horror movies, so this was not ideal. I had to go outside to change the connectors and ground block in the housebox and do a bit of work outside. When I came back in, she was walking around burping one of the baby dolls. Screw that, I told her I was finished, got a quick signature, and noped the hell out of there. I realized she was probably just a lonely older lady. Maybe she couldn't have kids of her own. I didn't know her story. I was sure she had one. I was creeped out and didn't look back. Compared to some other stories, it was probably mild, but to me, it was creepy as hell. Story 6. My friend was hired as a manager for an apartment complex and got me a job as the guy who fixes stuff. He takes care of the tenants, making sure their sinks and bathrooms work, mowing lawns, picking up trash, and handling other tasks. We both get free rooms and really good pay, and the owner of the complex is an awesome lady. It's a fairly large place with 12 buildings and 8 apartments in each, which adds up to a ridiculous 96 apartments. For the most part, my job is super easy, no set hours, I work on my own schedule, I'm friends with the tenants, and I have my own work shed. While there's no room for advancement, I can see myself doing this happily for 40 more years. That said, sometimes the tenants are weird, not so great, or downright terrible. My buddy tries to weed out the bad ones, but a few slip through. The worst or strangest 2 examples are as follows. 1. A young lady attending college in the area had her apartment paid for by her parents, but she was constantly getting noise complaints. These rooms were nearly NASA-level soundproof, so keeping them quiet was not easy. Complaints included tossing trash out her front door and moving other people's outdoor belongings. A pretty jerk move. There was also constant pedestrian traffic in and out of her apartment at all hours of the night, usually loud and rowdy. After a semester, we assumed she would flunk out. But this 180-pound college freshman made it onto the dean's list. My buddy went over the courtesy rules with her. Beyond the usual troubles, she never missed a payment, and things eventually calmed down a bit. Only to get word that her dishwasher was broken. I set up a schedule to go by and fix it. 9 months later, just kidding, I got to it the next day while she was at college. When I opened the dishwasher, I was shocked. It was full of condoms, every color of the rainbow. At least 24 different condoms were jammed into the blades. Different colors, sizes, and brands. I had no idea why anyone would have 24 condoms in a dishwasher. I grabbed a pair of tongs from my toolkit. You learn quickly what tools you need in this job, and got them all out. On my way out, her neighbor was waiting and got nosy. They let it slip that a bunch of guys had been over late the night before. So yeah, orgy/gangbang cleanup wasn't part of my original job description, but whatever. She moved out in her junior year, yet still goes to college and continues to make the dean's list. 2. Another lady moved in with her 2 kids, and everything was fine at first. Then she got a face. Well, let's call him Dave. This Dave basically moved in with her without going through the proper channels. By the time my buddy figured it out, a few weeks had passed. It became pretty clear when I was summoned to fix a broken ceiling light. And when I say broken, I don't mean a bad bulb. It looked like someone had taken a baseball bat and just started smashing the ceiling where the light was. I was half right. It was a broom handle. This Dave had gotten drunk and angry and gone to town on the light just to make a point to her. Whatever. I don't mess with that. I told my buddy, and he handled the rest. But when I went to fix the light, which meant replacing the entire fixture, yes, people, pro bono self-trained electrician at your service. Please don't tell anyone. I might get fired. I immediately noticed that Dave was, for lack of a better term, an artist. The entire place was filled with clay sculptures, paintings, and other pieces that Dave had made at some studio downtown and then brought back. All of them were crassly sexual. There was a clay sculpture of an unclad woman lying on her back, spreading her... Oh, well, you get the idea. There was a painting of a trans individual soloing onto a woman dressed in what I presumed was a shark costume. And it wasn't just a piece here or there. It was spread all over the apartment, which importantly, had 2 children living in it. I remarked on exposing children to this kind of material, but Dave didn't really get my point. He said he needed the pieces there to inspire him. I relayed all of this to my buddy, and not long after, Dave was banned from the property. The lady in the apartment was given an ultimatum, either face eviction or face heartbreak. She chose the latter, and Dave had to leave. However, he did not take his so-called inspirations with him. They were all stuffed into black trash bags and tossed in the dumpster by the lady after he left. I'll admit there was a temptation to keep one, but I have a girlfriend and wasn't about to go dumpster diving for that. My life is pretty fun. Story 7. I used to work for a furnace cleaning company. One time, my partner and I showed up at a house. He got excited because he grew up in that neighborhood, and this particular house was weird. He had always wanted to go inside it. First thing to note, there were tons of lawn decorations, mostly animals, but also lots of floating lanterns. As we got closer, we noticed 2 things. First, there was no front door or any way to reach a side or back door. Second, some of the deer lawn ornaments had their antlers removed and replaced with real deer antlers. Very strange. We couldn't get in or find a way to ring a doorbell. We called, and someone answered, sounding nervous. Did we really have to come inside to clean the furnace? All right then, they would just open the garage door to let us in. The garage door started to rise, and we went inside, knocking on the door to the house from the garage. Nobody answered. For nearly 10 long minutes, no one came. Finally, we opened the door and let ourselves in. The door opened at the top of a staircase that led down into the basement. Both the basement and the stairs were dark. We called out, but nobody responded. We went down the stairs into the basement and turned on the lights. It was a basement suite kitchen with really old appliances and dated furniture from the 70s. Still, no one was around. My partner started setting up, and I went to look for someone. I followed the hallway out of the kitchen and deeper into the basement. It was long, with lots of doors, but I ignored them and kept going. Eventually, I reached a spiral staircase roughly in the center of the house and went up. The upstairs was dark too, but not as much, since light filtered through the sides of the drawn curtains. Finally, I found some people among the dated furniture upstairs. It was a very old lady in a sheer nightgown with two extremely ugly, unsettling helpers, a woman and a man, both missing teeth, hovering around her. She said, "Oh, you need to go into all the rooms to deal with the heat registers. I thought you just cleaned the furnace." I explained that we did need to go into all the rooms. They looked nervous, exchanging sideways glances, but finally said, "Fine, go into all the rooms if you must." And so I did. There were a lot of rooms. The house was so big that it even had 2 furnaces. But guess what was in each room? Extremely sick, lonely, and dying people. They looked terrified when I walked in. All of them were hooked up to machines to help them breathe, covered in scars and barely clothed. None of them were prepared for some random guy barging in and messing with their heat registers. "Don't tell her I'm smoking in here," said one man. He was wearing only tighty-whities, a thin, worn bathrobe, and had a chest full of terrible surgical scars. "I'm not supposed to be smoking in here." And then, our truck exploded. Not exactly old, but it had seen a lot of use. The transmission for the vacuum function had failed. We called the office, figured out how to switch it back to the regular engine, strapped the broken part to the rest of the truck with a bungee cord, and got the heck out of there. Story 8. I have very minor experiences with rats and mice to share. First, I was a kid, and my mom lived on a farm. There were rats in the barn, a horse stable that also stored hay. At night, the rats were everywhere. When I visited on weekends, I would sit out there with my BB gun or a .22 and ping those critters all night. I could hit them from 20 feet away as they skittered across the rafters. My best setup was just sitting in a chair a few feet from a little hole in the floor. A rat would stick its head up, I'd pull the trigger, and its head would be gone. Repeat endlessly. I think my record for one night was several dozen rats ended. Of course, I didn't exterminate them all myself. It didn't take long for a couple of cats to finish the job. Second, I have a greenhouse behind my current home. I don't keep plants there except in the winter, so the rest of the year it's just filled with tools, fertilizers, and such. A few months ago, I foolishly stored a couple of bags of organic lawn fertilizer in there. One day, I opened the door and found clear evidence that mice had been throwing a gluttonous feast of unspeakable delights in the greenhouse. The fertilizer was everywhere, and mouse droppings covered the floor, but not a creature could be found. I slowly backed away, totally unequipped to deal with the problem at that time. A couple of days later, I remembered the mouse feast and returned to at least place the fertilizer bags in a plastic tub, but I couldn't find the lid. I had basically created a food-filled pit for the mice, keeping their smorgasbord of pleasure contained a bit. More time passed, and it became a problem I didn't want to deal with, but knew I really needed to. Eventually, I resolved to evict the vermin. It was a health concern after all, and I needed to reclaim the greenhouse and its contents. I put on a mask and gathered all the loose food into closed bins this time. I pulled everything out and power washed the shelves and other surfaces which were caked in mouse droppings with soap and water, then bleach, and then more power washing. I swept the bare floor and put everything back. I planned to pour sand around the base of the structure to keep them from returning through the cracks and maybe to erase my memory of what had occurred there. But honestly, I don't think it would have ultimately mattered. Anyway, through all of this, I never once saw an actual mouse, dead or alive. Not in the nearby grill, the patio, or in the house. They didn't get into the attic either. I have no idea where they came from or where they went. But I like to imagine that this enormous mouse civilization quickly rose to great prominence in my backyard, fueled by the seemingly endless food supply. Just a crazy fiesta every night, fogging up the windows of that warm and humid structure. And then, just as quickly, the food disappeared, and the society collapsed like a tiny Aztec empire. So, to answer your question, I think your options are to end them or starve them. Story 9. Both an EMT and a cable installer. I have 2 stories that could be considered the worst, one from each job. As an EMT in a largely farmland area, I responded to a call for respiratory problems at a local farmhouse. A lady was waiting out front to let us in. We had to walk through a very dark house to reach a back bedroom. As we went through, I noticed that the amount of chicken droppings in the house was increasing. Then I saw blood on the floor. My first thought was that the patient might be more seriously injured than we were told. Nope, their dog had gotten hold of a chicken and was tearing it apart in the corner of the living room. This did not faze the people in the least. As a cable installer, I once went to a house that seemed normal enough in a typical neighborhood. Inside, the occupants were foreign, and their English was very poor, so communication was tricky. I managed to explain what I needed to do and where I would need to go throughout the house. Eventually, I needed to go into the basement, but they were insisting I couldn't. That should have been my first clue. I explained that without going into the basement, I couldn't do anything. Since a different provider was hooked up and their lines ran down there, they finally agreed. I wish they hadn't. There was human waste everywhere, buckets of it. The floor was covered in urine. I don't know how I didn't smell it from the first floor, but when I stepped down, I immediately gagged. The man had a squeegee mop and tried to push things out of the way so I could cross, but I refused and had to get someone else to explain that we wouldn't do anything until they cleaned it up. Next up was a rotting dog underneath a trailer home. The strangest thing I ever saw inside someone's apartment was a painting of a honeypot on the wall, alongside a poster that looked like it had been drawn in crayon. It depicted the resident as what looked like Ursula, captioned with, "I am a god," and included some bizarre 9/11 scenario. The weirdest scenario I ever dealt with as an EMT was transporting a delusional woman who had walked several miles to a hospital. She believed she was 8.5 months pregnant and needed an emergency C-section. She wasn't pregnant, but she was apparently very hungry. She had bought 20 pounds of frozen chicken wings on her way to the hospital. The best we could understand was that she genuinely believed that after the C-section, she would walk back home with her baby and the chicken wings to cook for dinner. The hospital confiscated the chicken, and she did not want to go with us. But in her deteriorated mental state, she had already been committed before we arrived. On the way to the facility, she went into vivid detail about being bitten on the head by aliens while working for NASA when she was 12 or 13, and later being drafted by the German army as an American and deployed to Iraq. She claimed her head had been chopped off and a grenade shoved in her throat was then shot with a shotgun to detonate. She said it was okay though since she had surgery to fix it all. Story 10. Once upon a time, I was a door-to-door knife salesman. The office manager had done a large event at the county fair and gotten a couple dozen referrals, which she distributed to us salespeople. Predictably, I ended up at an absolute shack of a home. The front porch was a freestanding jumble of old lumber and reused nails, hanging about 4 inches off the proper house. The smell of mold and various urines was overpowering, and every floor surface literally squelched underfoot. Sitting on the couch was an enormous man poured into a threadbare pair of overalls with the bib half down, his hand on his, well, you get the idea. Next to him was an old bun woman who may have legitimately been catatonic. She wore a nightgown held together by the lace collar and crusted food stains. They were both watching a portable TV propped atop a broken 1960s-style TV set. My appointment was with the wife/daughter. She answered the door in pilled latex shorts and a stained, strained sports bra. We walked through the living room into the kitchen, where we sat at a disgusting table pushed up against a fake cardboard chimney. About 3 feet off the ground, there was a large hole smashed in it. When I first noticed it, it struck me as particularly odd within this house of horrors, and I lost my train of thought for a moment. The customer noticed and launched into a story about a previous Christmas when the ex brought over his new girlfriend. Her mom had pulled a knife and the ex promptly attacked the old woman. So her father choked the guy out and smashed his head through the fake chimney. I heard about the court case and everything. The weirdest thing I ever saw, on the wall behind her, there was a heap of food. Open bags of cereal, piles of crackers, cookies, chips spilling out of bags, moldy apples, leaking bananas, jerky, peanut butter and jelly, open jars of olives, frozen French fries and pizza, pickles, condiments, butter, very old eggs, pasta, Tupperware containers, raisins, puddles of goo, and piles of crumbs, all covered in rat feces on the grimy floor. Above this was an undulating black mass of flies, probably 8 inches across and thick. Thousands were stuck to this piece of wall, and little clumps kept falling into the pantry. I cannot imagine what awfulness was smeared there to attract so many flies. It honestly haunts me. I asked if they had power outages, but nope, that was just how they kept their food. There was a refrigerator, but I couldn't tell if it was working, and I'm sure it was horrifying to open. Bonus, at the end of the sales pitch, a cockroach crawled across my open-toed sandal and up my ankle. I died inside while shaking it off my pants leg and smashed it in the middle of the kitchen. The woman plainly watching. She demurred, looked away, and just said, "Oh, somebody got a stink bug." I ran away with her $800 check. I never felt so bad about making money. She should have put all that money into cleaning products and counseling, but she couldn't be dissuaded from buying super sharp knives for her violently dysfunctional family. Story 11. I'm a realtor. I was helping a doctor and her wife, an RN, find property in the country where they could build a cannabis farm. We were in Oregon, and at the time they were medical growers, though they now have a recreational license. They were on a budget. We found 20 acres for $450,000. The property had a couple of triple-wide trailers and some shanty-like apartments for migrant workers. All the residents had been given notice of our inspection and had left, except for one lady in one of the triple-wides. We were informed she medically could not leave, so we were to inspect the property around her. She was a relative of the seller. The seller's agent met us on site and warned that the triple-wide was a scene. We walked in, and there was an old-school wood stove actively burning. It was scorching hot. Magazines, thousands of them, were stacked all around as high as the ceiling. In the middle of the room was a hospital bed, and a woman who must have weighed 600 pounds was lying on it, unclothed. She had a very thin sheet pulled up over her chest, but her legs were exposed and covered in sores. Next to the bed was a daybed pushed against the wall. On it lay an overweight teen girl sucking her thumb and rocking back and forth. The bedridden woman informed us that this was her autistic 16-year-old daughter, and she was very upset that we were there. The girl looked at us and asked if we were going to kick her out of her home. My clients, being medical professionals, immediately went into care mode, trying to reassure the daughter and asking the bedridden woman if she needed any assistance or if there were any conditions we should know about. While they were occupied, I started exploring the rest of the home. I've seen a lot of decrepit fixers, estate houses, and foreclosures, but this one took the cake. It felt like stepping into a movie scene. I walked into a back room that was like a maze due to so many illegal additions and came across a very thin, frail-looking old woman in a thin hospital gown, sitting in a non-functioning-looking wheelchair. She smiled at me, showing no teeth, and motioned for me to look around. As I walked down the hall to another room and began to open a door, the bedridden woman yelled not to open the door at the end of the hall. I had just started pushing it open when it was violently shoved shut like someone threw their entire body against it. I completely noped out at that point, walked to the front room, told my clients I had inspected the structure, and said I was stepping outside, inviting them to join me. They ended up buying the property. From what I was told, the seller relocated the family members, and the triple-wide, being an illegal structure, was demolished. If it had been legal, I would have burned that thing to the ground. Story 12. I'm a code enforcement officer for my city. Recently, I responded to a complaint about a house with dead rats all over the outside. According to the complaint, it was so bad that you could see rats crawling in the yard and even through the windows. We get a lot of complaints about rats, and rarely is it an actual rat problem. Usually it's just mice. I had already issued orders on this house for something else and had been in contact with the owner. When I spoke with her previously, I was nearly knocked off the porch by the smell, but I couldn't see anything inside the house. Also, I can't write a violation notice for a person's hygiene. I went back to investigate the claim of dead rats outside the yard. Sure enough, there were at least 4 of them in the front yard. Considering the smell and complaints from neighbors and a police officer, I probably could have obtained a search warrant, but I decided to contact the owner and see if she would let me in. I had asked once, and she had said no, but it was worth a shot. When I called her, she said she was having a problem with her roommate and wasn't spending much time at the house anymore. She asked if I could do anything to help get him out. I told her I couldn't help evict anyone, but if the sanitary conditions inside were as bad as I suspected, my inspection might result in him being vacated. I asked what the inside of the house was like. She explained that the kitchen floors were in terrible shape and needed to be replaced. Still, she agreed to let me in. A few days later, I showed up with my supervisor and a city police officer, as her roommate had a violent criminal record. We went inside, partially at the roommate's request because he had the nerve to call in a complaint on her. The house looked like a game had been interrupted, and I now call it the Jumanji house. The rat infestation was so bad that I saw multiple rats running around. One even brushed past my boot. Anyone familiar with vermin knows that an infestation has to be extremely severe for you to see even one rat during the daytime. The carpets and floors were covered in rat droppings and dog feces. The kitchen floor was in such terrible shape that they had moved the fridge into the living room to prevent it from sinking into the basement. At one point, the roommate was showing us around. As he entered one of the bedrooms, he stopped suddenly, looked at us, and said, this looks bad." My supervisor and I just looked at each other, wondering what could possibly be worse than the rest of the house. Perhaps a portal to hell. It turned out to be just a freshly dead rat on a dresser that he hadn't yet tossed out the window. We vacated the house immediately. Story 13. I'm hesitating to answer this because A, as crazy as this will sound, most of the people involved were decent human beings in poor health or bad situations, and B, a lot of this stuff sounds far-fetched even to me, and I lived it, but what the heck? Submitted for your consideration. I worked briefly as a home care assistant for less than a year until I could return to my regular field. Essentially, I was sent to various people's homes, where, due to medical disabilities, they needed extra help with everyday household tasks. Here's a glimpse of what I saw during that short stint. Cora, a morbidly obese woman who required a Hoyer lift to travel between her couch and bed. To use the bathroom, she had to be transferred to her bed and rolled onto an underpad, lying sideways. Her husband, a legless amputee, would then put on latex gloves, spread her buns, and dig out the waste with his hands. Colo, another morbidly obese woman, also an amputee with no legs, put on her prosthetics, stood up, dropped an underpad on the floor, and said to me, "Okay, I've got to poop. Don't judge me." She balanced herself on her prosthetic legs as far apart as she could and proceeded to pee and defecate on the pad in the middle of her living room. Kai, an elderly man in his 90s with severe dementia, lived with his functioning autistic 50-something son who was also incapacitated by health issues. They had a mean-tempered little dog that was allowed to poop and pee anywhere in the house. Part of my duties involved cleaning up after the dog and taking it for walks. The father would do random, funny, or crazy things around the house, which set off his son into livid but ultimately impotent tirades. I actually looked forward to helping these guys because they amused the heck out of me. Story 14. I never did it for a living, but I tried it short-term. About 6 years ago, I was hitchhiking across the United States and heard about the supposedly great market for vagrants to make money picking and pruning weeds in the Emerald Triangle. Naturally, I headed that way. It was a small town, and there were an absurd number of travelers all trying to get work, clipping weeds. After hanging around for a day or two with no luck, I changed my cardboard sign to say I just wanted a ride to the next town, hoping to maybe stumble into a job along the way. A 60-something Willie Nelson-looking guy picked me up and drove me to the next town. We made small talk, and he mentioned that he had a small farm and was harvesting, but he didn't need any help. No problem. He dropped me off and I put up my sign again. About 5 hours later, the guy came back and said he needed me after all. I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, and I was desperate for work after sitting around for 3 days, so I agreed. We headed out to a few acres of land with a generic mid-size house. I met his son and a timid Hispanic man in his mid-20s, and we all smoked together that evening since it was already late. I slept in a renovated bus right next to the weed field with the Hispanic guy. The next day, things were looking good. We talked about pay and got ready to start work. I learned that the Hispanic man was from Costa Rica, and the owner said he had rescued him. I don't recall his exact words, but that was the sentiment. I felt bad for him and brought him back. Later, I found out he had been in the United States for around 3 years. When I asked how he liked it, he said, "I don't know, I've never left the property." That moment hit me a few days later. How had I not realized how messed up that was? After just 5 or 6 hours of work, the owner said he didn't have any more tasks for me, but he would pay me and drop me back off. On the way back, he started talking about how much money he had, and then directly asked me for intimacy, saying he could compensate me handsomely. While driving and putting his hand on my thigh, I removed his hand and told him, "Money doesn't make me happy," which seemed to completely perplex him. I got dropped off, and the rest is history. Looking back, this might be one of the biggest single regrets of my life. Story 15. Code enforcement can obtain search warrants, and in this situation, I personally would try to get one. Departments like aging or adult protective services, unfortunately, aren't very helpful when someone doesn't want their services. It's appalling that all the resources you've mentioned have failed so far. I hate to suggest resorting to the media because I generally dislike when neighbors do that, but in this case, it might be your last option. You could also ask the police to conduct another wellness check and explain that you have reason to fear for the occupant's safety, unless that's something you've already tried. Additionally, you might contact the fire department if they operate your city's EMS services. They can perform wellness checks and remove individuals from homes, similar to the police. I recently dealt with a situation where the occupant of a home was living alone, though she clearly shouldn't have been. The house was filthy, not nearly as bad as the Jumanji house, and her hair was one massive matted beaver's tail that reached past her knees. I tried working with her case manager from a local mental health agency, a public health social worker, and the property owner, but each was limited in what they could do. Since the house wasn't in a condition that required immediate vacation, and the property owner had addressed many of the biggest issues, I monitored the place and occupant closely for a couple of months. When I was finally able to re-inspect, the house hadn't improved. In fact, it was worse. A clogged sink was causing a strong odor. The property owner could fix the clog, but it was only a temporary solution for her overall situation. I turned to our community liaison officer and asked him to perform a wellness check. If the police determine that someone is a danger to themselves or others, they can pink slip the person, essentially taking them into custody, but instead of jail, they are taken to a hospital for evaluation. That's what happened in this case. The occupant was taken to the local university hospital for assessment, and while she was gone, I deemed the home uninhabitable, so she could not return. This forced her caseworker's hand to begin the probate process to appoint a guardian, someone with far more legal authority over her. Story 16. One of my friends was a personal chef who had just taken on a new client. She hadn't completed the full home visit process yet, but had sent the client the required materials list, contracts, and all other necessary paperwork. The home inspection was scheduled for the following week. Over the weekend, her father passed away. She needed to fly back to her hometown to make arrangements. She asked me if I would fill in for her, and once I agreed, she confirmed with her clients that it would be okay. None of them had any issues, including this new client. She gave me all the details I needed, and I essentially ran her business in her absence. The date with the new client arrived, and I called to confirm that I would meet them at their home at a specific time. I got there 5 minutes early and rang the doorbell. The client's 30-year-old son answered, soloing off. He insisted I come in, saying his parents would be out in just a minute. I tried to tell him I'd wait outside as I stepped back. Then his mother appeared, dressed in bondage and holding a bottle of lube. Before I could say another word, the father entered the entryway on his hands and knees. I told them my friend would call when she returned to town. They kept insisting I come inside because they had signed a contract. I felt bad and worried about causing my friend legal trouble, but I simply could not walk into that house. I got back to my car, drove around the corner, parked, and called my friend. I told her everything. She laughed, said that wasn't the worst she had seen, and apologized that I had to go through it. She assured me she could cancel the contract due to certain clauses and told me not to worry about it. A few years later, I was working in a retirement facility. Who were the newest residents and families wanting to meet the chef? You guessed it. At least this time, everyone had clothing on. The son would visit daily for several hours and wouldn't let any employees into their suite during his visits. Just as I was about to go to HR, one of the nurses reported seeing the son kiss his parents goodbye at the end of a visit. She said the parents took turns being intimate with one another. That family was moved out soon after. Story 17. Around the age of 19, I left college in the UK, and since my parents had decided to move to Spain, I had to take any job I could find. Through an agency, I landed a laboring role with the council, which meant doing whatever was required wherever they sent me. I had spent about a month stripping out kitchens on a council estate, and it had been a pleasant gig. Lots of friendly single mums would make tea and chat, and a few propositions came my way. Something I learned was common for guys working on jobs like this. Overall, it had been a breeze. One day, my boss pulled me aside and said he needed me and another laborer, a nice lad, but as thick as 2 short planks, to head over to a shared accommodation and help a tenant clear the room he was moving into. This should have been done weeks before. We arrived and met the tenant, a genuinely nice guy and a recovering drug addict. He handed us both dust masks. I asked if it was really that filthy, and he said, "Filthy isn't the word I'd use." He opened the door, and the small room was putrid. A mattress lay in the middle of the floor, stained with urine, feces, and blood. The floor was a minefield of dirty needles. The small wash basin in the corner was filled with stale vomit, with dried vomit smeared across the surrounding tiles. The walls looked like a Jackson Pollock painting. But the thing that really stuck in my mind was a tattered brown chair with a perfectly coiled turd right in the middle. I told the tenant he shouldn't be living like this and that we would sort it, as it was too dangerous. I headed to the van and pulled out hazmat suits, thick rubber gloves, and more masks. We went back upstairs, and within 2 minutes, my dim-witted colleague had grabbed a handful of needles and stabbed himself about 4 times, even though I had explicitly told him to pick up one at a time and put it in the hazard box. I called our boss, who sent someone to help me, and took the other guy to the hospital. The new guy walked in, looked around, and said, "Not the worst I've seen." Story 18. I've done maintenance work for years, starting in an apartment complex and now working for a large college. The absolute worst thing I've ever been involved with is evictions. I'll skip the bleeding heart stuff. I don't have the stomach for it. I did participate in one eviction where the girl being put out not only had a solid stockpile of what I assumed was cocaine, but also box after frigging box of dildos and homemade corn she had made herself. As I recall, the rental office held onto the items so she wouldn't be embarrassed on the sidewalk. Other than that, I've seen some truly impressive roach infestations, but little else that was truly noteworthy. Working for a college with tens of thousands of students living there is awesome. Almost all of them are totally cool, even though I'm old enough to be anyone's father now. It's really a lot of fun. It never ceases to amaze me how normal they are overall. Sure, sometimes someone will request a repair, show up 10 minutes later, let you in because they didn't answer the door, and you'll find them, well, pleasuring themselves in the living room. But that's unusual. I've run plenty of dumb calls over the years. There's a kid or two every year who's a total nuisance, along with other normal irritants, but nothing big. I'll tell you this though, one time I got a call for a clogged toilet in a remote women's room in the library and arrived to see the most terrifying dookie I've ever encountered. It was about 12 inches long and nearly as thick as a calf. It was so sturdy it bridged across the bowl. It still strikes fear in me. Really though, the worst I see is the work that others have done. Structural rot that could collapse an entire building. Water shooting up out of floor drains during major rainstorms because a contractor dumped cement into the storm drain. I've seen an unsecured swing stage crash through a window. Floods caused by someone knowingly letting a toilet overflow and going home for the weekend, soaking the floors below. CPVC sprinkler lines left to freeze in unconditioned attics. Sofas stuffed into elevators and set on fire. I don't know, but given the number of calls I've run over the years, people aren't nearly as weird or filthy as you might expect. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.